welcome to the fifth and final episode of a closer look at Bhutan through the eyes of a journalist and a musician. I'll start with a few introductory slides. So, Bhutan is a tiny and remote kingdom located on the eastern ridges of the Himalayas between its powerful neighbors of India and China. The Bhutanese name for Bhutan is Druk Yul, which means land of the thunder dragon, a reference to its wild thunderstorms striking the valleys from the peaks of the Himalayas. Now, for comparative purposes, Bhutan is a bit smaller than Switzerland, but has a considerably smaller population of roughly 780,000 people compared to 8.6 million in Switzerland. The average elevation in Bhutan is 2,200 meters above sea level compared to 1,350 meters in Switzerland. Its location between the Assam-Bengal plain of India to the south and the Tibetan plateau of China to the north gives the country considerable geopolitical significance. There are three major ethnic groups in Bhutan: the Ngalops, the Lotsam, and the Sharchop. And Ngalops are descendants of Tibetan immigrants and are dominant in the northern, central, and western Bhutan. They speak a variety of Tibeto-Burman languages, and the most common of these is the Dzongkha, Bhutan's official language. The written language is actually quite identical with Tibetan. An ethnically mixed population is found in the southern and southwestern part of Bhutan. And the Nepalese prevail in this region, and they represent the most recent arrivals in Bhutan and mainly speak Nepali. Now, most of the people in eastern Bhutan are the Sharchop, believed to be the earliest inhabitants of Bhutan. A Tibetan variety of Buddhism is the most common form of religion. Aside from Buddhism, Hinduism commands a significant following, particularly within the Nepalese community. Now, Bhutan's Human Development Index belongs to the medium human development category, positioning it at 129 out of 189 countries and territories, and it is roughly comparable to India and Bangladesh, but lower than the one of China and Sri Lanka, which we also treated in one of the episodes. Now, a country scores a higher HDI when the lifespan is higher, the education level is higher, and the gross national income per capita is higher. Something about geography and the economy now. So Bhutan's climate is perhaps more diverse than that of any other similarly sized area in the world. A temperate climate is found only in the central mountain valleys, where the capital Thimphu is located. The remainder of the country actually experiences either extreme heat, as for example in the Dwars in the south, or extreme cold, as is in the north. The economy of Bhutan is largely agrarian, and the significant variations in elevation and climate actually support a wide variety of crops and livestock. The relatively low, well-watered and fertile valleys of central Bhutan have actually the largest percentage of cultivated land. Now, because Bhutan is landlocked, trade and transit arrangements with India play a critical role in its economic life. Free trade with India prevails, and India is the source of the great majority of Bhutan's imports. India is likewise also the recipient of the bulk of Bhutan's exports, with electricity being the country's principal exported product. Now, as most of you probably know, GDP is actually not the most important measurement for Bhutan. The country's political and economic decisions actually do take people's individual happiness into consideration. For this purpose, Bhutan introduced the Gross National Happiness Index in the 1970s. Nonetheless, as you can see from the slide, Bhutan is a world champion in GDP growth, mainly due to its hydropower development. The GDP per capita was actually quite similar to that of India in the 1980s, as you can see in the slide, and is nowadays much higher. Now, some words about the history of Bhutan. Despite its long-standing tendency to isolate itself from the rest of the world, Bhutan was the object of several foreign invasions in the centuries after its establishment. In 1720, a Chinese imperial army invaded Bhutan, and later on, the British intervened several times in Bhutan, with Bhutan actually giving control of its southern border passes to the British. In 1907, Ugyen Wangchuck became Bhutan's king with British approval, and in 1910, the Bhutanese government agreed in a treaty to continue to be guided by Great Britain in external affairs. In subsequent decades, Bhutan gradually increased its relationships and exchanges with British-ruled India, although much of its trade at the time was still with Tibet. In 1949, Bhutan concluded a treaty with newly independent India, whereby India assumed Britain's former role toward Bhutan concerning its foreign relations. In the second half of the 20th century, the pace of change in Bhutan began to accelerate with improvements in transportation and the gradual opening up of the country, for example, with the first tourists allowed into Bhutan in 1974. Now, the governmental structure also changed radically. Reforms initiated by King Jigme Dorji Wanchok in the 1950s and 60s led to a shift away from absolute monarchy in the 1990s and towards the institution of a multi-party parliamentary democracy in the year 2008. Under the new system, an elected prime minister takes care of the administration of the country, while the king is actually the titular head of the state. Now, as some of you might have realized, one of the two originally planned speakers is unfortunately unable to participate today, but we have plenty of topics to discuss with our guests today. Let me introduce him. Kunga Tenzin Dorji, also called Supe, is a freelance journalist who received the Jigme Singye Wanchuk prestigious journalism award in 2016. He contributes to various publications, he writes scripts, he narrates documentary films, and he used to host a talk show on Radio Valley 99.9 FM. He is also one of Bhutan's best-known rock musicians and has acted in several films. Welcome, Supe. We will now start with a short series of standard introductory questions for you. And let me just remind you that these questions should be answered in a rather brief manner. Right.
Right. Okay.
So, perfect. Welcome here. And I'll start off immediately with the first question. So what fascinates you most about Bhutan and what concerns you most at the same time about your country, Supe?
Thank you, Simona, for that very kind introduction to my country as well as to myself. Quickly, let me just say thank you for having me here. And it's a pleasure to be addressing so many people out there whose faces I can't even see right now. Anyway, yes, to answer your question, what are Bhutan's strengths and what fascinates me most about my country and what concerns me most? In fact, there's just one answer for all these questions, in fact. I think what fascinates me most is our distinct way of life, which gives us our unique identity. And that is our greatest strength, I think. It is our greatest asset in ensuring our survival as a sovereign nation. But it is also the cause of my greatest concerns because it may be the reason why we may get left behind in a world that is rapidly changing as we speak. So, it will be hard for us to handle a world that is growing different each day. So that is my greatest concern as well.
Great, thank you. And if you only had actually a few words, how would you judge the current state of your country regarding society, politics, and the economy?
All right. I think the society is quite fair on the whole. And Simona, you're an expert in Taiwan. So kind of similar over there. We're bound by a sense of community. We have few differences between ourselves, but we do have our own issues as far as the society goes. As far as politics goes, as you well mentioned in the introduction a while ago, we have become a constitutional monarchy with a system of parliamentary democracy. And this happened only about a dozen years ago. So we've seen tremendous changes, but we're handling the change quite well. And apart from a few teething problems, I think we're evolving as far as politics goes. As for the economy, I think that's probably our greatest challenge. We want to grow. We are a very small country with a very small economy and a very small population. We want to grow, but we want to grow responsibly. And I myself think that we could have done much better as far as the economy goes. But however, the pandemic has just made things a little worse and a little more challenging now.
Okay, thank you very much for that very interesting and concise answer. Now, this may seem like a strange question, but I think it actually makes sense in what we are discussing now. Do you
Right.
think or do you feel that people have misconception about Bhutan? And if you feel that they do, what would these be?
All right. Okay. So there are a number of conceptions around, but misconceptions around. But I would think the greatest one is that a lot of people think we're this wonderful country with unlimited happiness, where everybody's content and smiling all the time, which is not necessarily true. So that would probably be the biggest misconception about Bhutan.
All right, that makes sense given the index you have. So where do you see Bhutan when actually comparing it with your bigger neighbors, such as India and China?
I think economically and technologically, we are far behind, right? But I think socially we're more equitable and a lot more secure.
Okay.
As yeah, as far as our neighbors go.
And now we near sort of like the end of the introductory part, and we go a bit more in depth into you as a speaker for today. So is there something you want to tell us about your background? So one thing that people should know in order to better understand your perspective on today's issue and on your home country.
All right. So I am a person who lives in the capital city, Thimphu. Which may not necessarily represent the rest of my country, because Thimphu is a little different. It's a little more modernized than most parts of the country. I was also educated mostly in a school in India that had a very strong British tradition, and I have traveled a little bit out of the country, both of which has in fact increased my appreciation and my love for my own country. I think that needs to be understood.
Okay, thank you. I think we also have time later on in the national identity part to go a bit more in depth about this very interesting background of yours. So now we are nearing actually the focus topic of our conversation. And here, of course, you will also have more time for less concise and more comprehensive answers. So what we're going to do for the next more or less 25 minutes or so is we want to talk more in detail about Bhutan, about the changes that the country has undergone, and especially about the role of the media in this process. As I said, the first section actually deals a bit with national identity. And this is also because we talked already in the prep talk about yourself. You have already addressed a little bit of this in the past question that I just asked you, but we know that you're a proud patriotic Bhutanese. Could you maybe tell all of us a bit more about yourself? For example, what are some of the things that you relate to? And would you say that form part of Bhutan's distinct, actually, national identity?
All right. Okay. Before I talk about myself, in fact, I don't want to talk too much about myself, but let's just deal with what we are seeing on our screen right now. You see me right now wearing this dress, right? It's called the ko. This is what the men wear, all right? It's very similar in design to the Tibetan ko, in fact, and it's probably inherited from there. It probably derives from the Tibetan ko. And I know that the Mongols also wear something similar. However, we have our own patterns, our own designs. And this is this is our business suit, basically. We wear this on special occasions. We wear this to work. We wear this to school. We wear this when we go visit temples, which is an important part of our normal everyday lives, by the way. Anyway, and now let me just, before all of that, let me just explain about the geopolitical reality here in this part of the world for Bhutan. And that will probably give you some idea of why we are the way we are, and why culture is such an important part of our lives. Okay, so now take a look at Bhutan. We're a small little dot, all right? We are wedged between the world's two most populous countries, China to the north and India to the south. These are also among the largest countries in the world, and have an economic growth rate that's probably, again, among the highest in the world. So in a sense, we are overwhelmed. We have no military power. We have no economic power. We're totally landlocked between these two countries. So, at a time, say in the 50s, when China was reputed for being hegemonistic and taking over their neighbors, and which they say is the story with Tibet. We were very wary of China. All right, we were very scared of them. And India had just become independent in 1947 as well. And we thought they were a far more friendly nation to deal with. And we decided to ally with India in a sense. But the danger of being overwhelmed by these large neighbors has always been so real that we figured with no economic power and no military power, the only way we can ensure our survival as a sovereign nation is to be different. And how do we be different? By promoting and preserving our culture. And which is why we dress differently, we speak differently, our architecture is very different, all of that. So culture has become, in fact, or was in fact, one of the key elements for our survival as a nation. So now, besides these external forms of our dress, our architecture, and the natural beauty of the landscape, I think our identity also springs from our way of life, as I pointed out earlier. Time stands still in Bhutan. Most places in the world, when we meet somebody, say in an office or on the street or at home, whatever, we're always judging how much time do I have for this person, right? And we prioritize based on our time. In Bhutan, somehow we've developed a way of life where we have time for each other. So I could be driving and I could possibly be seeing somebody that I know on the side of the road. I'll stop and I'll make sure that I have a conversation with him and find out how he's doing, all of that. Somehow or the other, we managed to make time for each other. So we, in a sense, have a feeling of communal harmony where individual needs are often subservient to the needs of society and people at large. And I think that is why we've been able to band together and work together. And nowhere has this been more apparent than today, the time of COVID-19. After the pandemic struck, we've all been able to band together and work together towards ensuring that we contain the outbreak. We all got vaccinated in record time. I think 90% of the population was vaccinated in a matter of a week, which has been lauded by the international community of nations. His Majesty the King led the charge towards combating this new enemy, this unseen enemy, and he's been extremely important, I think, in spearheading our fight against COVID-19. And the rest of us, the government and the armed forces, and it's amazing, people, young people as well as old people from all sections of society came forward as volunteers to patrol our borders, because you know how the situation is. We have an open porous border with India, and India has extremely high rates of COVID-19 infection. They now have the Delta variant as well. So we've been extremely careful about that. So we need people along the borders to patrol our borders, and people have been, volunteering, undergoing military training for weeks, and then going as patrol forces. They call the DSUPs, by the way, and they do all voluntary social work. So that's been amazing. And I think much of these values spring from our leadership, who embody these altruistic values in their work. In Bhutan, we've been extremely lucky to be ruled by a succession of kings whose sense of duty has always been exemplary. Okay, in that way, we've been so fortunate. The present king is the fifth king, by the way. His father, the fourth king, is still alive. And these reforms, I think, this spirit of altruism and social benefit was actually initiated, I think, first by the third king, who was the grandfather of the present king. So that's worked out pretty well for us.
Okay, Supe, thank you very much for this very interesting question that really encompassed a variety of things that we'll also be touching upon later on. You mentioned the COVID-19 and the sense of solidarity and commonality between the people. So thank you very much for that. I think now we can maybe go into another main topic of today's discussion, which is also related to your own background, right? I'm talking about the media component. So let me just give a brief introduction to the public. Radio broadcasting actually in Bhutan began in 1973, and television and the internet did not come to Bhutan until 1999. So for years, the country actually tried to limit influence coming from the outside on its culture and on the monarchy. The
Right.
introduction of TV and internet, as in other places, actually brought a lot of change to Bhutan. So my question for you would be, based on your own personal experience, could you tell us a bit more how you lived through these waves of modern influences coming from the outside since the second half of the 20th century?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think that will put a lot of things into perspective. So I must begin with not me and my life, but the lives of my parents. Okay. My parents grew up in a Bhutan where there were no schools, no roads, no hospitals, no postal service, no phones, no telegraph, no electricity. Imagine most of the audience today are from Europe. So just imagine Europe in the Middle Ages, before the Industrial Age, perhaps even before the Renaissance, all right? Because we didn't have a printing press. And, printing came only after the Renaissance, all right? So that's where we were in the Middle Ages, 60 years ago, that's where we were. Now, we are a landlocked nation, as I said earlier, wedged between India and China, and with no access to the sea. But we might as well have been an isolated island, for all practical intents and purposes. But all of that changed after the 1960s, when we opened up to the rest of the world and began our quest to modernize and join the international community of nations. So the changes that took place, say, in Europe over hundreds of years, took place here in a flash. That's how fast it was. So we therefore have people still living today whose lives span not generations, but eras, eras practically. So they're used to seeing change and they accept it quite willingly. I must add, although, that my country did not modernize blindly, all right? Rather, because we were a late bloomer, we took the opportunity to look at the mistakes of other countries as well as their successes, and we used those as lessons. So change in Bhutan, no doubt, was rapid, absolutely rapid, but it was never haphazard. It was planned, it was deliberate. I myself was born in the 1970s, and for much of my youth, right up until I was in my mid-20s, Bhutan remained a rather underdeveloped nation with little technological development. And that is compared to the rest of the world. Of course, the changes, if you compare it to the rest of the world, were really fast, the pace of the change. But the actual changes, if you saw physically, you wouldn't see much. You would still see a very underdeveloped country. But like my parents, I grew up to accept change. And additionally, like youth all over the world, my generation, I think, was also one that not only accepted change, but were also agents of change. So we put pressure on our society to change. And the introduction of TV and internet in 1999 must be understood in that context, So we understood when we brought in TV and the internet that that would change our culture and our way of life irreparably. But the internet and TV were both the necessary evils, I think, to a large extent. We believed that these were necessary and that if we were smart enough, we could use both of them constructively. Well, that was the plan, at least. It's a different matter what actually happened. Anyway, I think that more or less answers the question. But yeah, if you want me to elaborate further, we can.
I'm sure you'll have other opportunities because we stay on this topic, and actually because we now addressed changes coming from the outside, right, and imposed or accepted in Bhutan. Do you think there were also actually changes coming from within the countries in this regard that we could address here?
Oh, of course. As I indicated earlier, every generation seeks to change things, to take things farther than they've been before. It's a general rule, I suppose, of all societies. And the Victorian poet, Lord Alfred Tennyson, points it out in that famous poem of his, Ulysses, right? Where he says, the old order changeth, yielding place to the new. That remains a human truth, I suppose. So every society evolves. We progress or we degenerate, which is a matter of opinion, of course. So in the case of Bhutan, the drive for change from within may have been a little more pronounced than it is in most other countries. Because, see, we obviously felt that we had a late start and we needed to catch up with the rest of the world. So there was this will and this drive to change and to make things different, to catch up with the rest of the world. And as we did so, when we sought to catch up with the rest of the world, many of us were given scholarships to schools and to some of the best colleges in the world. So we have people who went to study in Oxford and Cambridge and Berkeley and all of these reputed universities. And all of these people came back with ideas, right? But here's the thing, like I said earlier, we've been very deliberate and careful in the way we've changed. So as far as our new ideas also went, we were also very selective and careful about what ideas we applied here and how we applied those ideas. So the ideas and the technology may have come from outside, but the will to change and the direction of that change has mostly come from within, of course.
Yeah, it would make sense. Otherwise, of course, the changes could not even be accepted. You're totally right. So my second question is also a bit of a follow-up to this one. It continues in the direction of, you also mentioned before the difference when you talked about your parents between rural and urban areas, right? And that you come from the city, you live there, so that makes you a bit, of course, different than people who might live in the countryside. So my question would be, could you address a bit for us, first of all, the differences in the availability, for example, of technological tools between rural and urban areas? And when you are doing that, maybe also tell us what are the predominant media platforms available in Bhutan?
Okay. Between the rural parts of Bhutan and the urban parts of Bhutan, in some ways there's a great difference. In some ways there's not. As far as basic infrastructure goes, there's things like drinking water supply, electricity, the internet, or at least internet connectivity, roads. These things are pretty equitable, all spread throughout the kingdom. But there are still many pockets within the kingdom that are very far, that because they are so remote and so high up in the mountains, that you would have to walk for days from the nearest road in order to get there. So there are still these pockets. There are still a very few pockets that don't have electricity, where people live possibly in the, say, 2 centuries back. that's their life, and it's extremely difficult to get to them. And so you have to try and understand why that is so. That is because we're a mountainous country. The Himalayas are the youngest 4 mountains in the world. It is extremely difficult to get any infrastructure built in the Himalayas. So even if you made a road, it would to a place that is like, as the crow flies, it may be just 2 kilometers away. But because of the gradient and because of the topography of the mountains, you would probably have to make a road that is 20 kilometers long in order to reach that place. So it's been extremely difficult, and we're not the most well-to-do country in the world. We have very limited resources, so it's been extremely difficult. But I must say that we've tried to keep basic infrastructure at least provided to people in the rural areas as much as possible. But of course, if you're talking about things such as bars and restaurants and discotheques and theaters and stuff like that, those obviously would be in the urban centers, and they wouldn't obviously exist in the rural areas. So you will find those differences. As far as media goes, it's difficult for print media to access the rural areas. Television, because it's become a lot more affordable now, I think has a wide reach throughout Bhutan, but there would still be some rural pockets that are inaccessible by TV. They would not be able to access TV simply because they can't afford it. And therefore, the most prevalent media, or the most widespread media, I suppose, in Bhutan would probably be the radio, because practically anyone can afford a small little transistor, right? So that is more or less the lifeline. I think radio in that way is extremely interesting in Bhutan.
Thank you. And so when we talked before, you mentioned something very interesting to us, the fact that sometimes, especially in the rural countryside of Bhutan, journalists and the media can actually be misunderstood as a sort of watchdog to address unfair practices, right? Could you tell us a bit about that? Do you have some stories for us regarding this?
Okay. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the media in Bhutan generally was subservient to the state till about a dozen years ago, till about 2007, 2008. It was always subservient to the state. So you had a media, but it wouldn't have been accurate to call the media free. Okay. However, with the political change, say in 2008, in fact, just before the political change, as we were gearing up for it, it was understood that Bhutan would need a wider and a more prominent media. So the media industry for the first time was liberalized in the sense that while it was all state-owned and state-run till then, people could apply for licenses in order to start newspapers, radio stations, or television stations. No television stations came up, but a number of newspaper organizations and radio stations did come up. So those were extremely interesting times. Now, so all of this was new to Bhutan. All of a sudden, we had this very liberated sense. People were vocal, and the media was pushing for more space, right? And the media was pushing for change as well. So in that fervor of democracy and of newfound voice, a lot of people began to look at media as being, the prosecutors, if there were instances of social inequity or of corruption involving government or officials, these would often be taken to the media. And the other speaker who was supposed to be here with me today, Namge, who couldn't make it, unfortunately, has been plagued by people thinking that she is a provider of justice because she was involved in highlighting a few prominent cases that came to light involving some prominent people in the country. And therefore, all of a sudden, people in the media were being looked at as these executors of justice. People thought they are the ones who will bring justice where the system cannot, and to some extent, that is the traditional role of the media, right? We talk about media as the fourth estate, as being almost like the fourth arm of government. When you generally, in most countries, you would have the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature. And the media would sometimes be unofficially accepted as the fourth estate, the fourth arm of government, more or less. And to some extent, that is true here as well. But people still misunderstand, thinking that, the media can bring all the changes and is, in fact, a prosecutor or an executor of justice. So it's been taking a while for people to try and appreciate and try and understand what the media actually does. But of course, there is always this exaggeration in their minds of the fourth estate, traditional fourth estate role of the media. So that's been happening quite a bit. But of course, things are changing. We're all getting a little more mature, a little more informed, and we're beginning to understand the changes around ourselves, and we're evolving as a society. So all of these things are, in fact, developing right now as we speak.
Thank you very much. Now, we know that you acted in several films and also you narrated a variety of documentaries, right? So the national film policy of Bhutan actually states that the industry in the country grew within a very short time span, producing about 30 films per year by the year 2010. Could you maybe, Supe, illustrate to us a bit the evolution of the film industry in Bhutan? Is it mainly influenced by India? What are some of the most prominent narratives and questions like this?
Right. It's interesting because just like most countries in the world, here in Bhutan as well, we have a commercial cinema, and then you have the more artistic cinema, and that remains true here in Bhutan as well. And the commercial cinema will always be a lot more noticeable. It is always a lot more digested. It has a greater demand, a greater appeal as well, and is better noticed. And then you have the arty cinema, which a very select few of people may appreciate, right? So it certainly appears that the art filmmakers, if you can call them art, or at least the avant-garde filmmakers here in Bhutan, don't find too many takers here also, because we're a very small population, right? You mentioned a while ago, we're under 800,000 people in this country, just above 700,000, in fact. So it's difficult to build an audience for anything over here, or a market for anything here. So these more arty type of films would be watched by international audiences and would be made, therefore, for such audiences. And I have acted in a few of them. They're always in our own local language, but with subtitles, etc., to make it digestible for international audiences. However, it's commercial cinema, of course, that rules the roost. And commercial cinema in Bhutan has gone in the direction of Bollywood, all right? As far as the treatment of the films go, because most of us, before Bhutan had the ability to make our own movies, we grew up on a staple diet of Bollywood. So our understanding of films, the language of films, in fact, in Bhutan is very Bollywoodish. So you would have generally topics surrounding love and romance, and you would have a good-looking young man and a good-looking young woman, and they'd have a whole lot of problems, and in the end, they get married happily ever after. Right, and in the interim, of course, they would have a lot of songs and dances, and people who fall in love would express their love by running around trees and hiding behind flowers. And that's still prevalent here in Bhutan. So those would be some of the popular narratives here as far as films go in Bhutan.
Great.
Right, Simona.
Thank you very much for this. And we are now actually approaching a slightly different topic, although it's connected, because we talk about what kind of influences the media brought in Bhutan also for younger generations. So of course we know that the expansion of the media also brought new lifestyle trends to Bhutan. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about Korean beauty culture, for instance. So my questions for you would be, if we take a look at Bhutan's younger generation, who are their role models? What are they influenced from? And what are some of the generational issues that you actually see within your country?
Okay, very good question, Simona, because that kind of gives you a deeper understanding. As I address it, it will give you a deeper understanding and an appreciation of life in Bhutan as it is today. Although we were this very ancient society that lived practically in the Middle Ages, right up until the 1960s, because of the tremendous pace of change since then, we are a lot more accepting of change. In our social fabric, our society has changed tremendously as well. But like I said, we've been accepting of change, but we've also been careful about how we change. And I also explained right in the beginning how culture, our distinct national identity and our culture, is a very important part of who we are and of our way of life. So all of that being taken into consideration, change has always taken place in Bhutan, but has always been measured, has always been very deliberate. All right. When we brought in media, television, cable television, and the internet, that is obviously, it opened Pandora's box because it's no longer in our control. Change happens all of a sudden organically. Well, not organically, but yeah, the government or whoever's in charge is no longer in control of the change, right? Because there's so many influences, so many currents that come along with the cable television. And you're right in pointing out that Korean culture has, pop culture rather, has taken a hold of many of our young people. And to be fair, that's been pretty much the scene throughout most of Southeast Asia, has it not? I mean, young people in Singapore, in Malaysia, in Thailand, even in Northeast India, through Taiwan, all of that, many of them look up to Korean pop stars and film stars. They even speak Korean. I don't know how our kids do it. They watch Korean movies and they are able to speak quite fluently in Korean. And I'm not complaining about all of that. I suppose, like I said, every generation has to try and understand that the subsequent generations or the younger generations would be more open to change than them. But yes, many of our younger people do look up to Korean film stars, Korean models, Korean pop stars, all of that. But here's the interesting thing. Because we have a very distinct culture, a very distinct sense of who we are, and because we are in a unique place, we have also been able to not lose ourselves. And we've been able to temper this change with the right guidance, I think, to some extent. So while a lot of our youth will definitely be influenced by Korean pop culture or pop culture from anywhere else, Justin Bieber is extremely popular here, by the way, particularly among the younger lot, as maybe many of these rappers that you find from the East Coast and the West Coast, etc., in the US. But nonetheless, because we've had the kind of kings that we have, they've been our role models also. Also, you know, the G&H, we talked about gross national happiness. We have what we call G&H studies as part of curricula in schools. So children actually go through G&H education where they learn about values and attitudes. So that has been able to ensure that many of our kids, as influenced as they may be, right? So you might have a young person who has an extravagant hairstyle that's green or pink and all of that. But he would, if he went to a temple, if he went to school, if he went to work, he would be wearing something like this. And he would still be distinctly very Bhutanese. So I think that's a very interesting part of the changes that have taken place, but how we've tempered those changes. Yeah, Simona.
Yeah, so because you just mentioned now also kids in school learning about the values and the Gross National Happiness Index, I skip ahead and I have one question regarding to that, right?
Hold on a second. Sorry, Simona. Let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
Just one thing I wanted to point out, that while we've been, is that okay? I mean, is that okay?
Go
All right, okay, thank you. All right, so just one thing I wanted to point out also, that while we as a society have been more open to change, and our older people, our parents, my generation, all of us, we're a lot more accepting of change. However, that has not translated in the halls of government, by the way. The government, as far as the bureaucracy goes, the executive, they're extremely guarded, extremely traditional, and extremely resistant to change. They don't want to lose the old structure. They don't want to lose their power and their hold on the system. And therefore, because of their power interests, they do not accept change very easily. So just wanted to point that out.
Well, actually, that's good because we remain on the subject. Before we open up to the Q&A, I see we already have quite a few questions. And I think the webinar is also extremely interesting and actually really focused on people asking questions, but we remain slowly with the, just very briefly with the government, because you just said that it is more restive to changes. And my question, which is the one I wanted to ask before, we know that in 2013, Prime Minister Sri Lanka said that Bhutan's actually much lauded concept of the Gross National Happiness Index is overused and that it's problematic because it actually does mask the real problems facing the country, like increasing debt, chronic unemployment, poverty, and corruption. How do you feel about that?
All right, so this is two questions in one, actually. Simona, you were talking about how Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister Topke says that this whole hullabaloo about G&H, how that masks all the real problems. But you also asked what sort of measures Bhutan has taken in order to lessen some of the less desirable aspects of modernization. So I could take these two separately. Let me relate the first part of the question, the G&H, how that masks our real problems, to the biggest misconception about Bhutan, which you asked me right in the beginning, right? And I told you that the biggest misconception out there is probably that we are this very happy society where everybody's smiling. I think it would be fair to say that we are a happy society. If you go by the happiness index, by all reasoning, by all measurements, we are a reasonably happy society. But it would be unfair to assume that all of us are happy all of the time. G&H has got international attention, no doubt. And in fact, the whole entire concept, and I don't need to be too elaborate about this, but let me just touch upon it, the brief history of G&H. The entire concept came about when sometime in probably the 1980s, I think, early 80s, His Majesty the Fourth King, who was the king back then, was asked by a journalist, I think it was the London Financial Times, probably, about, the gross national product of GDP, gross domestic product, about and gross national product, also GNP, of Bhutan. Because by all traditional economic indicators, whether you looked at maternity mortality rate, per capita income, all of these things, GDP, all of these things, we had some of the poorest statistics in the world. So when His Majesty was asked this question, His Majesty just said, for us in Bhutan, GDP or GDP may not be all that important. For us, gross national happiness is important, because it was true at that point. Everybody had land. There was no poverty at that time, and although we may not have been the richest nation in the world, we were extremely happy as a people. Also, we had very simple way of life, and people seemed happy with that, content with that. Then we tried to develop that into a concept, into a philosophy. GNH, gross national happiness. And we've gone through many, over the last 30 years or so, we've gone through many exercises to try and quantify it, to try and make it workable for us as a formula. And I think we've done reasonably well as well, as far as that has gone. But because of the word happiness, a lot of the world that has come to associate us with this idea of being an extremely happy place. And in fact, people right across the border in India, for example, many of them think, Bhutan, that's the happiest country in the world, which may not be true, right? But it must be understood that we are people like anywhere else in the world. We're people who have the same motivations, we have the same needs, we have the same greeds also, right? And we have the same problems as well, such as debt, unemployment, poverty, and corruption, which you highlighted, right? Now they have now to address the second part of the question. We do have these problems. What are we doing about it? All right, not much, actually. I think there have been initiatives as far as say unemployment. We have many employment schemes. We have schemes for sending our youth abroad to places in the Middle East, for example, to work in the service industry there. What was the other thing? Poverty. Yes, there are poverty alleviation initiatives and projects being initiated every day. Debt, as far as our debt goes, yes, we are a very import-driven society with very few resources of our own. So we have to try and boost exports. So yes, in recent years, there have been initiatives taken to make ourselves more acceptable elsewhere and to boost our ability to export. So these initiatives have taken place, but I would say that these are far and few between. Particularly where corruption is concerned, we don't have too much of a corruption issue here. Fortunately for us, being a small society and still being extremely respectful and fearful to some extent of our king, things are more or less in order. To a great extent, things are more or less in order. But there is still corruption. And however, there's not been too much done. And I think that has probably been, and in fact, I hinted at this a while ago when I talked about the bureaucracy, the executive. So try and understand this. We have a bureaucratic system that we inherited from the British, actually. Seems like a strange system, seems like a strange statement, right? But let me explain. So I told you we opened up to the rest of the world in the 1960s, early 1960s. So when we say that, actually what we mean is that we decided, okay, we'll have diplomatic relations with other countries, but our main partner is going to be Big Brother. That's India, right? So India is our big brother. And therefore, when we started building our first schools, our first roads, had our first hospitals, our first doctors, our first accountants, our first teachers, all of them were Indian. We had to bring them in from India and then learn from them, right? So similarly, even the bureaucratic system, the executive, was a system that we borrowed from India. The Indians themselves inherited the system from the British Raj. And the British bureaucracy, back then when they controlled India, the entire bureaucracy was designed to keep local populations in check and ensure that they remained in control and they had the power, right? So that was the value system of the entire bureaucracy of the British, which the Indians inherited, which they passed on to us. And that has continued to survive right now. It has undergone very little change, all right? In fact, therefore, it has taken somebody like His Majesty the King himself to recently say, hey, we need to do something about our civil service. It needs to be restructured. It needs to become more efficient. And it had to take somebody like him to try and initiate that sort of a movement. But I can honestly say that the bureaucracy is still fighting that change. They're very safe and secure in where they are. And as long as they have the power, as long as they're okay and doing well, they couldn't be bothered too much about the bigger national issues and national problems. Which is not to say that we are a country that's totally corrupt and things are going totally wild. Things are working out for us. But I think we can do far better just if the bureaucracy pulls up their socks and does a little better. And that's the truth of our situation here today.
Thank you, Supe, for the very comprehensive answer. Now we are actually reaching, unfortunately, the time of our conversation, the final moment, but I want to open up to the questions from the public. There's quite a few. So first of all, there's a sort of like, I hope you feel comfortable answering it, but from the way I see you, it's probably no problem for you. More of a geopolitical question regarding, first of all, your relationship with India. Has it been affected or not by the pandemic? And another question that actually talks about your relationship with China, and especially in the sense of a cultural, whether you have a cultural relationship with China. I'm assuming it's also meant, for example, cultural exchanges or in the movie industry and stuff.
Right. Let me point out again that India is big brother as far as we're concerned, and for very practical reasons. I explained a while ago also how when we opened up to the rest of the world, China had just swallowed up Tibet. So we were extremely careful of them. We were extremely wary of them. We were scared of them. So our tendency was to lean towards the Indians, who we understood were a democratic country, who would be had just gotten independence and therefore valued the idea of sovereignty and independence, and therefore would be similarly respectful to us. And that's how we've always looked at India as, and you also mentioned in your intro how we had this arrangement with the British where they would guide us in our foreign relations, right? And that after Indian independence, that passed on to the Indians according to a 1910 agreement, right? And that remains even true today. Countries can have diplomatic relations with Bhutan, but we would always seek the advice of India. Is it okay? Is it fine? We're extremely wary of that. So even although we are a member of the United Nations, even in the UN, we would rarely initiate something of our own without the nod of approval from India. That's how careful we are as far as India is concerned. And for very real reasons, because they are our immediate market for anything that we produce. You mentioned also how our principal export is electricity, and those and that hydroelectric power goes all the way to India. So they are our greatest consumers. For anything that we produce in Bhutan, the biggest, most ready market that we have is India. And for very real geopolitical concerns as well, as far as our security goes also, we are dependent to a great degree on India. And for the simple reason that India and China back in the 1950s also, or 60s in fact, they had a war. There was the Indo-China war, right? So they've been very careful about each other since then. And for us to have aligned with India, therefore makes us outcasts more or less as far as China is concerned. So while China has made overtures of friendship to Bhutan, we're still very careful because we don't want to hurt the sentiments of big brother India. Right. So our interactions with China have been very limited. But it is most certainly true that culturally we have, or historically at least, we have more affinity and deeper roots towards Tibet. Mm-hmm. That's where the religion, the dress, the culture, all of that has more or less come from Tibet. And there's been very little Indian influence. However, if since the mid 20th century onwards, the influence from the south, from India, has been far more pronounced. And our interaction with our northerly neighbors, China, has been extremely limited. But the COVID-19 has not changed anything. In fact, it has it has developed our relationship with India even further, because they were kind enough to give us our first dose of AstraZeneca vaccines. India gave it to us totally free of cost.
Maybe remaining on this topic, I'm sorry if I interrupted, but we have so many questions that I think it's important to ask them. So remaining on this topic, actually, somebody would like to know how Bhutan has fared against the corona pandemic and whether there were a lot of travel restrictions for tourists.
Yes, right now, there's nobody coming into the country and none of us are going out either, all right? The only flights that go out of Bhutan are for Bhutanese returning back home. And these flights are arranged by the government. So I know in the very near future, in fact, next week or the week after that, there's a flight going to Singapore. So that all the Bhutanese in other parts of the world who need to come back home can assemble in Singapore, and they will be picked up from Singapore and taken and brought back here, back home. Of course, they'll have to stay in quarantine for 2 or 3 weeks as per COVID-19 protocol. As far as our dealing of the pandemic is concerned, we've known tremendous success. It is amazing. Really, it is amazing. Right now, we have about, around, say, 1,500 cases. We've had around 1,500 cases up until now. Going by global statistics and by percentage, we should have at least, let's say, 150 to 250 people dead by now, all right? Going by the statistics elsewhere in the world and how little COVID-19 is. But we've known only one death, only one so far. And that also because that person had pre-existing conditions, had kidney issues, liver issues, all of that, and was in fact going to die anyway. So it's just that he contracted COVID-19 and his death was accelerated more or less. But other than that, we've known no other case of death, and every other person who's been infected has recovered well. I don't know what our doctors are doing, but somehow we're getting things right. As for the rate of infection also, it's been extremely controlled because His Majesty the King has been there on the front lines. He has been the one who's been patrolling the borders, going to see the voluntary workers all around the country. He is probably the most quarantined person in the country right now because he goes out to these high-risk areas, boosts the morale of the security forces and the volunteers, spends time with them, looks into all the preparations and our safeguards and preventive measures. And then when he comes back to the capital, he has to undergo quarantine, right? And he does this repeatedly. He's probably been in quarantine 15 times by now in the last 15 months. That's how busy he is. And he has a 1.5-year-old son at home. And his sense of duty is just, it has made him not sit still. And that has transpired in a way to the rest of us. So the security forces, the government, everybody's on their toes, the doctors, the medical workers, the volunteers, even the public themselves. When we have a lockdown, very few people violate the lockdown. We all work together. We understand the importance of the situation, the critical nature of the problem. And as far as COVID-19 is concerned, I think right now we're doing extremely well, much better than most other countries with the kind of resources that we have. We're doing extremely well, I think.
Thank you, Supe. Thank you very much for this. I am really sorry that we are actually nearing the end of this conversation. I know you did a brilliant job because I see that there are a lot of questions and even people asking for a follow-up session with you. And so I'm sorry for those of this question I have not been able to address, but you did a wonderful job in outlining some less known issues regarding Bhutan's media system, geopolitics, and the introduction of communication technologies. And now to end today's session, I'd actually like to bring in some more questions, very brief questions and very brief
All right,
answers.
I'll try and answer them briefly also. right?
Perfect. Exactly. That's what I wanted to say, right? Brief questions and brief answers. So first of all, if we are ever allowed to finally travel again and visit Bhutan, what would be the place you would recommend for us, and what should we eat while we are there?
Okay, Phopjikha. Remember that name, Phopjikha, Phopjikha. It is a spectacular valley that is at an elevation of about 3,500 feet above sea level. But it is this very wide and undulating valley that, as a topographical development at that altitude, you shouldn't be finding a place that's that open and as beautiful as that an open expanse as Phopjikha. But go there. That would be, it's an extremely beautiful place. And you also find the very endangered black-necked cranes, which is an endangered crane species. You find them, a lot of them in Phopjikha. So it's a beautiful valley. To me, it's like the gods carved a piece of earth saying, okay, this is what heaven looks like. Bhutan, you get to keep it. That's what heaven is. Really? That's how I feel. Right. I was driven to tears the first time I went to Phopjikha, by the way. And as far as eating goes, when you come to Bhutan, don't forget to eat ema tatsi. It's a chili concoction with cheese. It's vile, it's hard, it's difficult. It'll bring tears to your eyes, but it's worth the experience.
I'm already looking forward to it. And the final question would be, what is the best thing you could recommend to us to either read or watch about Bhutan at the moment?
Okay. I would say, there's so much material out there that you could pick from, but if you can, online, try and see the late Anthony Bourdain of CNN. Right, he had his last travel in his Parts Unknown in that series was actually in Bhutan. And I had the good fortune of having a nice conversation with him, an hour-long conversation with him as well. Unfortunately, the good man has passed on, he died, but it's still online. So if you look at the episode on Bhutan, I think that is a fairly accurate assessment, and it gives you some appreciation and understanding of Bhutan. As for something to read, there's so much out there. I'm not quite sure what to say. The History of Bhutan by Karma Pintso is a good book, but it's a little voluminous, may not be something that all of you want to read. However, there are books like So Close to Heaven, for example, which is a book that came out, I think, maybe 25, 30 years ago, written by a New York Times journalist called Barbara Crossett. But that'll give you a pretty clear understanding of the geopolitics and the reality here in Bhutan, and would make you understand and appreciate our situation as well. So yeah, I would recommend those. And of course, there are so many others. The Circle of Karma, for example, is another book. It's fictional, but it's written by a Bhutanese writer called Kunga Tenzin Dorji, and you would find that is quite revealing about our society and our culture as well.
Thank you very much. Now, once again, unfortunately, we're coming to an end. So thank you very much for all these great insights, Kunga Tenzin Dorji Supe. And thanks to all of you who joined us for this great last episode of a first series of A Closer Look, as well as for the excellent questions, making the discussion even more lively. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you all. Got it, Chair.